Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute. I wanted to show you an example of Hebrew wordplay in the writings of the Apostle Paul. And before you go saying, that's crazy, Paul wrote his letters in Greek. Yeah, I agree with you. In all probability he did, especially when he was writing to Greek-speaking people, like, for instance, the cities in Greece, or maybe even in Rome. Although, that's, as a little side note, that's interesting because there are some different opinions about that. Western Christians generally read, they have Bibles that are based on the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, but Eastern Christians actually have Aramaic manuscripts of the New Testament. For instance, it's called the Peshitta text of the New Testament. And Aramaic, and the Eastern Christians believe that the Aramaic is the original and that the Greek version is a translation. So there are some questions there. It's interesting to explore. But let's just go on the assumption that Romans was written in Greek. So look at this verse here. It says in Romans 13:8, he says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." It's a beautiful verse. I love the concept. Now, what may surprise you is that there is a very close connection between the word for owe and the word for love in Hebrew, and also in Aramaic. And before you say, wait a minute, why would Paul have any kind of Hebrew wordplay? That's probably just a coincidence. Think about this for a moment. Context, I'm sure we both agree, is very important when it comes to Scripture. Basically, if you don't get the context, you're gonna be in danger of misinterpreting stuff and making stuff up. And we don't want to do that. So what's the context of the letters of Paul? The context is Saul of Tarsus. There's this urban myth out there that Jesus changed Saul's name to Paul, and it's actually not true. Just if you go read the book of Acts for yourself, he had his Damascus Road encounter, and then he's still called Saul for several chapters after his Damascus Road encounter. The first time he's actually called Paul, it says, "And Saul, who was also called Paul." So basically, he was like many Jewish people then, and Jewish people today. He had a Hebrew name, and when he was, moving in Jewish circles, he would go by his Hebrew name. And then he also had a Gentile name, and when he was out there in the world, he would go by his Gentile name. So most Jewish people today, maybe they have a regular name like Matthew or Bill or whatever, and then they'll also have a Hebrew name, so-and-so Ben so-and-so, so-and-so the son of so-and-so. So that was common back then, and it's still common today. And if you actually look in the New Testament, there are a couple other guys who have a Hebrew name and a Greek name. There's a guy named, I think it's called Jesus, called Justice, if I'm not mistaken. Jesus is Yeshua. That's a Hebrew name. And then he also had his Greek or Roman name of Justice, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, there are a couple examples of that. So, the context of Paul's epistles is a guy who stood up in front of a mob in Jerusalem and said, "I am a Jew." He still identified himself as a Jew. A guy who described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now you have to understand what that means. In Jerusalem, in the Second Temple era, there were the Hebrews and there were the Hellenists. Remember, there was a fight between the Hebrew and the Hellenist disciples of Yeshua, and in terms of their widows and who got food, who got fed. And so that would be a little example of that. So the Hellenists were the Greek-speaking Jews. They read the Septuagint, and they practiced Judaism, but they probably also were interested in Greek philosophy and whatnot. Philo was a first-century Jewish philosopher who lived down in Egypt, and he would have been an example of a Hellenistic Jew. And then there were also the Hebrews. The Hebrews were the more traditional Jews who actually spoke, guess what? Hebrew and Aramaic. They're both living languages in the Second Temple era. So the Hebrews, they were Hebrew speakers, more traditional Jews. And so Paul, if he were to identify where he was in that spectrum, he'd say, "I was a Hebrew of Hebrews." In other words, I was as Hebrew as you get. He grew up in Jerusalem, learning at the feet of Gamliel, who was one of the greatest sages of his generation. You can read about Gamliel in the old Jewish texts like the Mishnah and the Gemara. So that was Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, a Hebrew of Hebrews, and this guy who grew up as a kid in Jerusalem, memorizing the Hebrew Bible, praying the old traditional Jewish prayers. And so, yes, even though he clearly he spoke Greek, you may remember in that story about the riot in Jerusalem. He spoke Greek to the commander who was rescuing him from the mob, and the commander was surprised. He said, "You speak Greek?" So that's interesting right there, because most people back then we see didn't speak Greek. It was unusual for a Jew to speak Greek. Actually, Josephus said something very similar. He said he took great pains to learn the Greek language, and that was something that was frowned upon by his nation. Jewish people didn't look kindly on people who learned the language of the Greeks. Similarly, actually, if you're familiar with Jewish history, then you'll know that after the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD or 70 CE, as Jewish people would say, there was another uprising about 60 years after that under Bar Kokhba. It's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and it was crushed by Rome. But it's really fascinating to look at the coins and read the letters that are available to us from that time period. All of them were written in Hebrew as a living language, with the exception of 2, which were written in Greek, sort of like over 100 letters. 2 were written in Greek, and one of them included an apology for writing in Greek because he didn't know any other language. So, anyways, it gives you a bit of a sense of a kid growing up in Jerusalem, what he would have learned. So even though Paul's letters may have been written in Greek, what we know is that he had a Hebrew brain, and so even when he was writing in Greek, he had Hebrew word connections in his mind and meanings from the Hebrew language. And I mean, you can see those all through his letter to the Romans. I'm actually doing a study going through Romans verse by verse and reading it in a translation into biblical style Hebrew. And I'm pointing out those places where the Hebrew, the Hebraic mindset of the Apostle Paul really shows through. All right, so here's an example for you. And I think this is Hebrew wordplay. I think this actually was there in the mind of Shaul, but I'm not just going to ask you to believe me. I'm going to show you the evidence, and you tell me what you think. All right, so, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. Let's look at this phrase as it was translated by Franz Delitzsch, who was one of the greatest Christian Hebraists of history. He was a very devout Christian who lived in Germany in the 1800s and was a professor at a university, actually. And he also loved the Jewish people, and he loved studying the old Jewish texts because they helped to explain the Bible better. And he actually ended up translating the New Testament into a biblical style Hebrew. This is a page of his translation right here. It's the translation that I'm working from in my Hebrew verses studies, going through Romans. And I'm going to show you this verse in Hebrew. Maybe you haven't seen the language before. If so, I'd like to introduce you to the Hebrew language. Here's a page. I think it's very beautiful. It reads from right to left, so it reads like this. And specifically, okay, this is in verse 7. So he says, Lachen, therefore, Tanu, give, Lechol ish, okay. And you know what? That's actually not the verse that we want to read. Here it is. We want to read the next verse, verse 8. I hope you enjoyed that little snippet from that verse. Okay, so he says, V'al tiyu, and don't become chayavim. All right, so the verb behind this word is chov. That's the chov is the noun, and if you want to pronounce it as a verb, it's chuv. They're both actually spelled the same. The vav can be an o or an u sound. So the verb itself is chuv, and it means to owe a debt, to be indebted to someone or to be obligated to them. It's a really big theme, actually. The theme of debt is it kind of took on like a bigger meaning than just like literally owing something to somebody else. It came to mean like your obligations, what you're obligated to do, what you should do, how you ought to behave, or that kind of thing. And that's why Yeshua taught us to pray. He didn't teach us to pray, forgive our sins. He taught us to pray, forgive our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Why? because in the Hebrew mindset, it's that big theme, the theme of debt. It's not just literally owing cash to somebody else. It's your obligations to another person. It's what you should be doing. So if you have a sense of entitlement and you have these expectations, well, this person should treat me that way, and this person, they ought to be acting this way, and this person owes this. You owe this to me. All of that is wrapped up in that Hebrew sense of debt. And Yeshua says, if you want to experience the freedom of the Father's forgiveness in your life, then you need to learn to let go and extend that same freedom and that same forgiveness to other people. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So it's a really big theme, and I could talk about that for a long time, but hopefully that helps you to understand it a little bit better. All right, so that's the verb chov. And then, so if you want to say like you're, people who are indebted, then you say chayavim, right? So he says, don't be chayavim, don't be indebted. Leish, to a man or a person. Devar, a word or a thing. So don't owe anybody anything, basically. Zulati, except ahavat. So that's the verb ahav means to love. It's actually related to the verb to bring something to someone in the sense of giving a gift. So in Hebrew thought, love and giving go hand in hand. What does it say in John 3:16? For God so what? The world that he what? God so loved that he gave. So that's another example of Hebrew wordplay. These are very closely related words in the Hebrew language. In John 3:16 we see that. All right, so that's the verb ahav. And then the noun is ahava. You probably heard that word before. I come from Western Canada, and there was actually a spa in my city called Spa Ahava. And I think there are also like Dead Sea skincare products named Ahava or something. I don't use Dead Sea skincare products, so I wouldn't know. But anyways, you probably know that word. It's a pretty big word, right? So Ahava, that's the love of ish, that's a man or a person, et, with reyehu. So that's his reya. And actually, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this word too, because there's some wordplay in this chapter based on this word also. Now, this is really neat because a reya in Hebrew is it's a friend. That's the word for friend. So the love that each person has to their friends, and that word is often translated as neighbor in English, but there's another Hebrew word for neighbor. So this more has the sense of your friend. So now. Now, I had mentioned the word for love, ahav, and how it's related to our word to give. There's another Hebrew word for love, and that is chavav. And that's related also, and that's the one I want to look at with you. Because I'll be quite honest with you, I think that Professor Delich may have missed something here. He may have missed the word that Shaul would have used. Because there are several synonyms in Hebrew for love, and there's one that is almost identical to the Hebrew word for owing a debt. And I want to show that to you, and I'll present the evidence, and you can tell me what you think. So, excuse me, I just coughed in your ear. That was absolutely terrible. I'm recovering from a cold, and I'm a little hoarse. So, okay, so this is the verb right here, chavav. This is from Alexander Harkavy's Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew. I really like this one because he gives instances of the word. And you can get this actually off the resources page of our website at holylanguage.com as a PDF. You can use it for yourself. Okay, so here's the verb, chavav. You can see that it's used in Deuteronomy 33:3. It says, chovev amim. He loveth the people. Beautiful. And then he actually says compare, okay, and then there's a Talmudic term here. And before you freak out, because we just used the word Talmudic, let me explain a little something to you about Hebrew. There's biblical Hebrew, and then there's also Talmudic Hebrew. And sometimes, for some people, if you mention the word Talmud, they react very strongly. They'll say, well, doesn't the Talmud say that Yeshua is burning in hell? Or maybe, doesn't the Talmud say this or that? No, you need to understand something about the Talmud. It's basically the Wikipedia of Judaism. So it's something that was written over the course of hundreds of years, and it's this huge hodgepodge of history, parables, spiritual teachings, case law, like it's gigantic. If you study a page a day of Talmud, you're going to make it through the Talmud in about 7.5 years. And actually, there is a cycle in which the Jewish community does that called the Daf Yomi. So, are there some things on Wikipedia that are maybe incorrect or that are downright evil? The answer is yes. Does that mean Wikipedia is bad or that you shouldn't use it? It has no historical value. The answer is no. You still use Wikipedia. All right? And it's the same with the Talmud. So yeah, there are some messed up things in the Talmud. There are some things that aren't historically accurate. But that's the very teeny tiny minority. The vast majority of the Talmud is extremely useful when it comes to understanding how the Jewish community has interpreted the Torah, how the Torah was lived out in Israel in the time of Yeshua, and just understand and getting a decent overview of the history of the Jewish people, right? So anyways, if you have never read any Talmud yourself and all you've done is just gone by hearsay and maybe a couple snippets taken out of context, I hope that you aren't throwing tomatoes at your screen right now, because like I am on your screen, and if you throw tomatoes at your screen, you might think that that's me and the tomatoes will go like splat on my face, but they actually won't. They're just going to get all over your screen. So don't do that. And anyways, I just hope that you study for yourself and that you don't just go by hearsay. That's what I hope. And be a Bible believer, stay in the scriptures, obviously the Talmud isn't on the same level as the written word of God, but it can be useful. And this is a little example. There are two kinds of Hebrew, as I mentioned. So you have the Hebrew, you have biblical Hebrew. That's the Hebrew in which the Bible was written to from Genesis to Malachi. It's kind of like Shakespearean English. It's high Hebrew. It's really quite formal. Now, Malachi was written right around when the Jewish people came back from their 70-year exile to Babylon, or at least some of them did. Most of them stayed in Babylon, actually. But they came back, and they were speaking Aramaic and Hebrew at that point. And Hebrew continued to be spoken as a living language all the way through the Second Temple era, which was roughly 500 years. And then it continued to be spoken as a living language for a couple hundred years after that. And we know that because the Mishnah, which is like the oral law, when it was finally written down in the late 100s, it was written in Hebrew. And it was written in its own style of Hebrew. And you can tell from the Mishnah that Hebrew was a living language that was actually being spoken amongst the Jewish people. It had its own like grammatical nuances, and it flowed slightly differently. There was sometimes you had some words that were used in the Mishnah that were Hebrew words, but they weren't used in the Hebrew Bible. So that's sometimes referred to as Mishnaic Hebrew, or it's also referred to as Talmudic Hebrew. Why? Well, because basically the Talmud consists of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is the oral interpretations of the Torah, and all that oral history when it was finally written down. And then so it's basically the Mishnah is the original commentary on the Torah. And then the Gemara was written about 300 years after that, from 200 to 500. And the Gemara means like to complete something. So it's basically it finished, along with the Mishnah, it finished the Mishnah off. It was basically a bunch of commentary on the Mishnah. So Mishnah is commentary on the Torah. Gemara is commentary on the commentary. And together, Mishnah and Gemara equal Talmud. Right, so basically those are the two kinds of Hebrew. You have biblical Hebrew, and then you also have the Hebrew that was used for about 1,000 years after the actual Old Testament was written down, and that's referred to as Mishnaic or Talmudic Hebrew. So now you know why Talmudic Hebrew isn't evil. So here we have this Talmudic term chabev, which means to cherish, and chiba, which is that kind of love, a cherishing sort of love. So I really love that about Hebrew. It's a very beautiful and poetic language, and this is an example of that. It's also very concrete and powerful language. And I'm actually going to show you another example of this. Oh yeah, okay, this is interesting. Moses' father-in-law was named Chovav. That's actually that's word. So he was probably a lovable guy. And what's interesting, just as a side note, is that this verb is it's buried on either side with Hebrew words that mean to hide. Isn't that interesting that the word to love is hidden in the middle of a couple of Hebrew verbs to hide? You can see this whole section here, this whole entry is just all about this verb to hide, chava. And then you also have chava spelled with a hey instead of an aleph, and it's the same thing. So something about love being hidden, or maybe when you love, then you let go of the fig leaf that you're hiding behind, and you stop hiding, and you allow yourself to step into the light and be seen by the one who loves you. So anyways, there's some beautiful things there that we could explore that I'm not going to delve into right now. So that's this is Harkavi. I want to show you Gesenius's dictionary entry now. He was very cool. He really explored where words came from, and he also compared them to related Middle Eastern languages like Arabic or Syriac, which is Aramaic. So here's the entry, and I know this is a little fuzzy, but I think we can make it out. So just squint, okay? So chavav, to love. He points out it's where it was used. Then he gives the Arabic cognate related word, and also the Aramaic. And he says the primary idea lies in breathing upon, warming, cherishing, whence chov, which is a lap or bosom in which we cherish. Okay, so we see that this word for love, chavav, it's related to the word for your lap or your bosom, chov. That's exceptionally, and that's an example of how Hebrew is very poetically beautiful, and it's also very concrete. The scripture talks about the wife of your bosom, or the woman of your lap. It's the same word. Whom you cherish. He says, compare further under the root ahav. So you can see here how the main Hebrew word to love, ahav, it's related to this word chavav. And then this is really neat too. A manifest trace of this origin is found in the Syriac to burn as fire, burning heat, especially from blowing. Okay, so you can see how Gesenius really explored the origins of this word fully. Right. So now that's my first line of evidence, just showing you that there are two Hebrew words to love. One is ahav, one is chavav, and they're related, but we have one in particular that was used more in the time of Paul, a cherishing sort of love, in the Mishnaic Hebrew. I'm going to show you one more thing. This is the Peshitta text of the New Testament. This is the Aramaic that the Eastern branches of Christianity claim was the original. Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Now this is something else you can get on our website on the resources page, along with several other Hebrew versions of the New Testament. And this one is extremely rare to find, actually. I don't know if you're going to find it online anywhere other than our website. And because it has this translation of the Aramaic Peshitta written in Hebrew characters, and then also a translation into modern Hebrew. So in the modern Hebrew it says, "All to you, and don't be chayavim, debtors, devar la'ish, a thing to anybody, ella, but rather le'ahov, to love zeh et zeh." This one to this one. All right. So now let's look at this in the Aramaic. Now, firstly, in Hebrew we have the word ish for a person. In Aramaic we have anosh, which is actually also another Hebrew word for person. Midam la tchuvun. So here we see the verb for owing a debt, chuv, in tchuvun. So don't owe anything to anyone. And then it says ella, but rather, which is a Hebrew word also, chad lechad. So chad is like echad, one. So chad lechad, one to one, which is a beautiful picture of love. One person loving another person. Le machavu. See that? In the Peshitta, the word used is actually this this word that's closely related to owe a debt. So if you look, it's basically the same thing. Tchuvun, owing a debt. Le machavu, to love. So I picked up on this connection just from my own Hebrew background, but it was really exciting for me to look at the Peshitta and realize that it's confirmed in the Peshitta text. So that's a little example of Hebrew wordplay in the Greek writings of the Apostle Paul, showing the underlying Hebrew fabric of the New Testament, the Jewish context of Matthew to Revelation. I'm going to show you two other neat little word connections, Hebrew word connections in Romans chapter 13, just briefly here. I think you'll enjoy this. All right. So firstly, he says, almost right after that, he says, love does no harm to its neighbor, something like that. You know what? Let's get back here to the New American Standard. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Okay. Let's look at that phrase and how it would be phrased in Hebrew. It says, ha-ahava, the love, lo tara. So the word for evil or bad in Hebrew is ra, and then it's also used as a verb here. And this word for evil, concretely it means to be rotten. If you can imagine rotten food, it's bad. It can also have the sense of being broken, like something that's a toy that's broken and it needs to be fixed. It doesn't work anymore. So that's another example of how Hebrew is very concrete. Evil is an abstract moralistic term. It's metaphysical in a sense. But in Hebrew, evil means like fruit that's rotten and you can't eat it anymore, or a tool that's broken and you can't use it anymore. That's evil. It's an evil fruit, evil tool. So maybe that helps you to understand evil a little bit better in the Hebrew mindset. Now, it also means to hurt something or someone, to do damage, and that's probably the best sense of the word here. Love it doesn't hurt other people. It doesn't damage others. Whether it be their persons or their property. And then so that's the word for evil here. Now look at the word for a fellow, a neighbor, a friend. La rea. What's the word for a friend? Rea. Remember I mentioned that earlier and I wanted you to notice it? It's basically, it's two words that are spelled the same but they're pronounced differently and they come from different verbal roots, but they're very closely related. So here we have ra, spelled reish ein, and that means evil. And then we have rea, spelled reish ein, spelled exactly the same, and it means friend. So what does this teach you? It teaches you that friends are evil. Your friends are evil, and you shouldn't trust them at all. In fact, you shouldn't even have friends. Just kidding. Don't quote me on that, okay? But is there a connection? This is something I enjoy doing. Is there a connection between friendship and hurt? If you've had friends, then I think you know the answer to that. The answer is yes, there is. Yeshua and Judas probably being the best example. When you open your life to people, and you allow them into your inner circle, and you even let them into your heart, so to speak. You become attached to them. It's those people who have they're able to hurt you worse than anybody else. They're able to do the greatest damage to you emotionally, and sometimes in other ways also. And that's a connection that I see anyway between the fact that the Hebrew words for friend and this word for evil that has the sense of hurt or damage. They're basically the same word. Now, along those lines, I want to show you one more almost chilling example of Yeshua and Judas. Just like Judas did so much harm to the master. Not just hurting him emotionally, but betraying him and handing him over to the authorities who wanted to unjustly execute him. So there was massive damage that was done there. There's another example of that in this chapter, actually. At the end of this chapter, Paul says to clothe yourself with light and let it be like your weapon. And I wanted to show you the Hebrew word for weapon because it's neshek. And if you were to ask an Israeli, what is neshek? What's a neshek? Do that sometime. You're going to get an interesting response because it means two things. It means weapon. For instance, if you've ever been to Israel and you've been to the Kotel, the Western Wall, you go through security and they ask you, yesh lecha neshek, do you have a weapon? Do you have any weapons on you? And so Israelis may say that, or they may say it's a kiss, because that's also what it is. The word neshek means kiss and it means weapon. And again, what did Judas do? How did he betray the master? With a kiss. So in this moment of stabbing Yeshua in the back, so to speak, absolutely betraying him, he did it with a kiss, and it was like a weapon. What's the connection? Well, whether it be your lips on your lover, or whether it be your weapon, your baseball bat against the head of your enemy. In both cases, you're coming in very close contact, first-hand touch, so to speak, and that's the connection. Basically, it's just very close engagement. So you engage with your lovers through your let's say lover. Hopefully, if you only have one lover, if you have a lover, you engage with your lover through kisses, and you engage with your friends, so to speak, and you engage with your enemies through weapons. Anyways, so that's another little example of Hebrew wordplay that may have been in the mind of the apostle. We don't know. This one maybe not so much because he was actually, the topic here was weapon. But I thought it was interesting that there is this Hebrew word, and it does mean two things. And we just talked about how the Hebrew word for friend also means hurt. So now you learn that the Hebrew word for kiss also means weapon. So I don't want to talk about this in an insensitive way. I'm sure we've all been hurt by people that were close to us. And I hate to say this, but I'm sure we've also hurt the people who are closest to us. And, I don't know. I'm sorry if that brings up any pain in you. Maybe it's comforting for you just to know that that's recognized in the Hebrew language. Friends and pain, kisses and weapons used against someone to damage them. But be encouraged too that Yeshua has gone through the same things that you have. He was betrayed at one point. He was hurt very deeply. It ended in his unjust execution, for crying out loud. I don't know if you can get hurt any more deeply than that, like even just physically. And so he's experienced those things too. So whatever suffering that you may have gone through, that you're going through, it's the fellowship of his sufferings. There is someone who has experienced that also, and who's there with you, and who loves you, and who offers you his empathy. And as you allow yourself to feel those things with him and let those things go to him, you're going to experience his fellowship. Actually, this is really interesting too. The Hebrew word for fellowship is chavurah. That's also the Hebrew word for a bruise. So if you've ever been bruised, or if you have bruises on your soul, just allow those bruises to be a place where you can fellowship with the Messiah in his sufferings. He loves you. He feels with you. And everything is for a reason. So I didn't want to just talk about those connections in kind of an impersonal ha-ha way, because I know that's some deep stuff. So thanks for joining me in this conversation, talking about the Jewish context of the New Testament and the Hebrew brain of the Apostle Paul. It was fun presenting some evidence to you, and I will let you make a decision on that. If you are interested in learning more about the Jewish context of the Bible, the Jewishness of Jesus and his disciples, the guys who wrote the New Testament, come see us at holylanguage.com. We have a focus on discipleship to the Messiah, coming closer to him through Hebrew study, learning about the context of the Bible, and doing that as a way to grow in our love for him and become more like him. Kind of similar to what I'm talking about right now. I mentioned that this is a takeaway. This is one takeaway from my Hebrew verses study going through Romans chapter 13. It's a takeaway from our course looking at the Hebraic fabric of the epistle to the Romans. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, if you're a serious student of the word, or if you just want to get closer to God and grow in your discipleship to his Messiah, I would love to see you. Come say hi at holylanguage.com and continue to follow Yeshua and know that he's there with you right now.